Hey, everybody. Welcome to Daniel Davis Deep Dive live from Washington, D.C. And we have with us as a guest today the ever popular Matthew Ho, former State Department official, former combat Marine, and all around great guy. Matt, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Danny. It's good to see you.
You know, we should schedule one of these one day where we just sit and talk about good stuff because, you know, off camera, you and I do that a lot. But it seems like every time we get on here, it's always talk about some problem that we have and something needs to be fixed. But, well, I'm glad we got somebody that's a good guy like you that cares about people to come and talk about those things and put some positives into it. So I'm glad for that. But we do seem to hit on these issues a lot.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. There doesn't ever seem to be a break, right? You know, it doesn't seem to ever be a break, even for a week when there's not something to talk about that is not, life and death and, extremely serious with long-term continuing consequences. So
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know, maybe in the new year we'll find something.
Maybe we will. Let us hope. Let's just put a little bit of hope into the future here that we can get back to something like that, because that would sure be great. But nevertheless, even with this, it's useful, I think. And one of the reasons we have Daniel Davis Deep Dive is because we can provide some context for what's going on. Oftentimes people see things in the news and they just see reports. They don't see any explanation for it. And sometimes you can get the feeling like things are inevitable or this is just the only way things are. And you need some context for some things. And that's what we do here. And that's what we're going to do right now in this situation. We want to talk today about a situation you probably see in the news. It's in there quite a bit here of late. And that is the U.S. has been firing airstrikes into Syria. We have been on the targeted end and receiving of lots of drone attacks and missile attacks and mortar attacks, et cetera, on our troops in Syria and in Iraq. And in case any of you have missed it, though, here's kind of the latest issue of the situation on that.
The Pentagon says they're being hit by Iranian-backed militias provoking U.S. airstrikes in Syria early today.
Tonight, the Pentagon says Iranian-backed militia groups are at it again, launching another drone attack on a base with Americans, this one in western Iraq. There were no casualties. But it comes just hours after a U.S. show of force intended to stop Iranian-backed attacks against U.S. troops in the Middle East. The U.S. conducting 2 airstrikes in northeastern Syria overnight, and according to the Pentagon, hitting buildings housing weapons and ammunition. The Pentagon saying the facilities were used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. The U.S. says its strikes are designed to stop the attacks without sparking a regional war.
Yeah, that's the issue there, is it how to respond to these things without starting a war, without getting any of our troops killed. But, it's important to, I think, point out how we got here. And we talk about providing context. Many people, when you see these reports like the one we just showed there, you think, well, this is just the issue. Iran's just a bad actor. And man, they're just going to keep doing this. And this is the way it's being characterized by many. And we got to go in there and punch them hard, as Nikki Haley said on the last Republican debate here. We just got to hit Iran hard and show them who's boss. And then, of course, they'll back down is the idea on that. They're the fantasy on that. Yet even as this clip showed there, when we have punched them hard, it's had no effect at all. But to understand a little bit of why they're even there, let's go back a little bit and try to figure out, when they came back in the first place. Now, a lot of this really goes back to the U.S. war in Iraq in 2003, when we went in on fraudulent justification of weapons of mass destruction. And I think we all know how that worked out. But an unintended consequence of that was the formation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, who was, of course, everybody knows was the, bin Laden and all that, 9/11. I think we all have a vivid understanding of that. But as we got into this insurgency in Iraq, we started fighting the Al-Qaeda. Then we started getting with some of the with some of the Iraqi Sunni insurgents. I actually got them on our side to go after Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That we jointly wanted to, they were an enemy of both. So we significantly harmed them and damaged them, but didn't destroy them. And so they kind of went back and licked their wounds a little bit. In about 2012, 2013, they reformed into the Islamic State. And so then they started having operations in Iraq and in Syria. And then In 2014, they finally got into a large enough force where they started actually taking land and seizing cities in both Syria and Iraq. And in 2014, when Mosul fell and entire Iraqi divisions literally melted into thin air and ran away into the desert, Obama felt like he had to do something. And here's what he told the American people.
We're prepared to send a small number of additional American military advisors, up to 300, to assess how we can best train, advise, and support Iraqi security forces going forward.
But he was quick to reassure a war-weary public that this is not the start of a major troop commitment.
I think we always have to guard against mission creep. So let me repeat what I've said in the past. American combat troops are not going to be fighting in Iraq again.
Yeah, you always got to be careful with mission creep, but dang it, we're not going to do that then. But see, then, Matt, what these guys, Obama and others before and after, they always start off with a little bit here, a little bit there, and then we start expanding because a couple of hundred doesn't really get any notice, but then you get 300 here, 400 there, then things start adding up. And then the next year, he went from Iraq to Syria.
President Obama said he's expanding the military force in Syria by sending 250 additional special operations troops to train and assist local forces fighting ISIS. This raises the U.S. troop presence in Syria to 300 on top of the growing American footprint in Iraq.
So, Matt, are they right, or was Obama right? Did we have to send those troops both into Syria and then Iraq?
Danny, it depends upon when you want to set the date for the time machine, right? What point do you want to go back and reconsider your decisions? And what point do you want to go back to and say, this is what should have been done? I think you've had decades of American policies that have made these kinds of things inevitable, because to the point you're getting at, you put more troops in and then you got to put more troops in and then you got to put more troops in, right? I mean, like, it just keeps building. You keep having this creep. And unless you go back and address the fundamental policies that are the things that are resulting in these troop presences, you're just going to have this continual sustained American presence that, something happens and you have to respond to that. And then, and it just builds. And that's essentially what mission creep is. Certainly they could have done things much different in Syria, primarily not pursuing a policy of trying to exact regime change on the Assad government, right. And the same thing too, even in Iraq. One of the reasons why the Islamic State has success in Iraq in 2012, 2013, 2014 is because the Sunni population has been, victimized by the majority Shia population. You're right. That type of oppression causes the Sunnis to look for help, and who's there to help them? Who's the only help they can find? It's the Islamic State. So, yeah.
I remember I studied a lot about the first part with the Mosul there. It's ironic. It was so ironic that the big push that started with this, Iraq had, I believe it was 2 full divisions that were manning Mosul at various places in here. And ISIS sent 1,000 guys into Mosul intending for it to just be a raid and then to leave, because they know they're obviously outnumbered, whatever it is, 30, 40,000 to 1,000. But because of the Iraqis, 2 things, because the mainly Shia Iraqi army was so poorly trained and their leaders were so awful because they had been put into there by Maliki because of their political connections, not because of their military capacity. So they were terrible military leaders. They just started to crumble, and underscored because, as you just said, a lot of the Sunni population were victimized even by the Shia military there, that they eagerly turned to help the Islamic State. And all of a sudden, all those guys ran, and Islamic State is like, whoa, we have a whole city now. It was crazy.
Right. And it's two aspects of American policy here that, you see it really exposed for what they are. One, it's the divide and conquer policy, which empires throughout time have utilized. But here you have this. If you divide and conquer, well, the side that is losing out, the side that is being oppressed, the side that has the world superpower against it, they're going to look for help wherever they can get it. And very often that comes in very extreme forms, like we saw in Iraq. And then the other part of it is, well, through this divide and conquer policy, if you're particularly pursuing the use of proxy forces, and the main driving impetus, the reason for those proxy forces being on your side is money, is cash, that's going to just create a system that is incredibly corrupt. So what you have in 2014,
and it's also transactional, and it can change tomorrow if the money gets better somewhere else.
That's exactly right. And then, so what you have then is you have an Iraqi army in 2014 that's not a military outfit; it's a business deal, right? You mean so?
Right. Well said.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the whole thing. Particularly too, I mean, it's so egregious there, as you could probably explain it better than I can, where everybody buys their position.
Yeah.
Right. So if you want to be a battalion commander, it's however X amount. You know, you want to be a brigade commander, it's 3 times X. You know, I mean, so but this is, you see those consequences of American policy really play out in 2014. The futility, the counterproductive nature, the stupidity of divide and conquer, and of having proxy forces that are motivated primarily by money.
Yeah, and the issue with that is that doesn't actually solve any of the problems that led to conflict in the first place. And the only reason we're supposed to use our military, well, the fundamental reason is only if to defend our interests if we're attacked. That's the primary purpose. And so a lot of these other things are just extraneous things are not intended to anyway. But even if you go to the next level and say, well, they need to accomplish something of strategic value, not just tactical actions. So we do things that have tactical actions, but that don't contribute to any sustainable outcome. And so then you're left with this, you can accomplish every tactical task, but at the end of the day, you've got a strategic loss. So that seems to be what we have been doing here.
Yeah, that's a really well said, Danny. I mean, really well said. I mean, that ultimately then goes back, I believe, to, well, you know, the first day of International Relations 101, you're taught that, you know, foreign policy is ultimately the reflection or the product of domestic politics. And you see that where we have a domestic political system that is so wrapped around, that is so motivated, really its whole being is encompassed by the short term. Right. Yeah. Whatever's going to be on the next news cycle, that's what our domestic politicians, that's what our domestic policy reflects. And so our foreign policy, by extension, right, that's what it ends up looking.
And then
like.
the 2-year election policy, which are intertwined, I think.
Right, exactly. You
never
can't
longer than that
either. You know, and one of the things that drives this, I think, that's so interesting is the evolution in American warfare. Because it's not, you know, I mean, I don't want anyone thinking that American foreign policy has remained static, that you know, people, while the same ends are being pursued, the means have evolved, they have been adjusted, they have changed. And one of the biggest ones you see is during the Obama administration, where it's you know, the U.S. government, this is no longer possible for us to put large amounts of American troops on the ground and sustain casualties. It's just not. So we have to pursue these wars in a manner that is hidden from the American people, or at least the costs are hidden. So we're going to use special operations forces and CIA. Yeah. We're going to use contractors, because contractors don't count. You know, most people be amazed to know that more contractors were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan than American troops. And all those contractors, as you know, Danny, were doing jobs that in previous wars they would have had a uniform on.
Yeah.
Right. So the true number of KIA for Iraq and Afghanistan for the U.S. military is not 7,000. It's really about 15,000.
And the same is true right now on the ground in Syria. I mean, they keep saying this number. There's about 900 U.S. troops there. There's about 2,500 in Iraq. But I bet there's probably close to 3,000, maybe even more total personnel in there. And I don't even know how many in Iraq. It's got to be upwards of 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, I would guess, when you add all the civilians into it. But Matt, I want to look back at one thing here before we shift on to the next section. And that is the premise that Obama had to send the troops back there in the first place. Now, he came into office saying he was going to end the bad war in Iraq and get the troops out, and he was going to finish the good war in Afghanistan, and he was going to get the troops out. That's a separate issue that he didn't end up doing that either. But so he did withdraw them in 2011, I believe December 2011. as he had promised to do when he first came into office. And he said, "Yay, I did what I said. I made my promise." But then when the Iraqi army fell and ISIS rolled into Mosul, then he sent the troops back in there in little increments so that he could end up getting what he wanted in there. But what I have argued in the past is that he did not need to send any American troops back, not advisors, nobody, because it was ultimately Baghdad's problem. They are the ones that got themselves into this for the very reasons you just mentioned about the Shia and the buying of positions, and they could have gotten themselves out there. It would have taken longer. It would have been more costly for them. That's their issue. They should have solved it. We shouldn't have even gone back in there, in my view.
Right, exactly. I mean, you saw when you were there, you saw firsthand how effective the popular mobilization forces were, the Shia PMF, the Shia militias were, and ISIS did advance not far from Baghdad. They made it down to past Tikrit, I think down by near Balad, but then they were stopped by an organized Shia resistance, and they would have been rolled back, as you said, regardless. It might have taken longer, but they would have been rolled back regardless. But at that point, though, the media frenzy about this, and how effective ISIS's own propaganda, their own media operations were. They were televising themselves cutting off the heads of people, and the victims of their atrocities were seen throughout the world, and they were presenting themselves as an organization that had or they were being presented more, I should say, as an organization that came out of the ground, that this is just pure evil. Like, these are like the orcs from Lord of the Rings. They've just come out of like some cauldron someplace, and there's nothing you can do but, like termites in your house coming out of the ground. There's nothing you can do but destroy them. And that is, at that point, when you get to that point in 2014, politically, what is possible for the president? So the United States had, whether it was Obama's previous decisions, George W. Bush's decisions, Clinton's decisions. I mean, you go back, George H.W. Bush. I mean, all these things compound on one another till you reach that point where here Obama has no choice because of
let's look at that. Let's look at that point right there at Obama. For all the things that led up to it and all the things that you just mentioned, both politically in the U.S. and tactically on the ground that existed there, did Obama have a choice? So he said he got out of there in order to, to make it good on his campaign promise. But what was the political cost to him to not go back in with some of these troops? And because when you're talking about these smaller numbers, that's not going to make any difference other than psychologically, perhaps for the Iraqis to, okay, we got the Americans on our side, but it's not going to act. They're not even fighting. So it's not like they went back and pushed ISIS back. What was going to be the dynamic between whether Obama did or didn't? Let's just say for a minute that he hadn't yet made that final decision. What were the political pressures on him that made him lead to that decision? And what do you think would have happened had he not?
Sure. You had the 2014 midterms coming up. So Mosul falls late spring, early summer of 2014, if I remember correctly. And so you have the midterms, and you have
June 2014 to be specific.
Yeah, June 2014. So you have the midterms in 5 months. And you have had successive Democratic Party losses. I mean, people remember the Democrats during Obama's time in office lost more than 1,000 seats across the country. In terms of at the federal level and at the state level, 1,000 seats. So the Democratic Party in the White House were constantly under this pressure to not bleed out more politically. So I think that type of, a Democratic president, the first Black president to not respond forcefully. They also had seen how successful, I think, the escalation of the war in Afghanistan was politically. While even though most of the American people were against that, particularly by 2012, 2013, by 2013, actually, the Afghan war is the most unpopular war in American history. But what you have, though, is it takes the pressure off because people aren't voting on that. Obama has committed.
What did you say this? I remember, Matt, because at the Republicans had been hammering on him almost from the outset that he gave away Iraq and that it was a big mistake. I think John McCain was a big one on that. And so now he looked weak, and now they're saying, aha, see, I told you, you left behind, you left too early, and now then they have risen again. That was one of the big things. And so that was one of the big pushes.
And there was this pressure too, because whenever what you would have is particularly in his first term, people like David Axelrod or Rahm Emanuel saying to the president, like, yeah, look, if you want to follow this, that's one thing. But if a bomb goes off in Times Square, remember there was the attempted Times Square bombing, bomb goes off, you're going to pay politically. They are going to raise bloody hell. So politically, it's best to just go along. You don't have to go as far as McCain or Graham on these wars, but go along and be seen as tough. Because ultimately what it came back to was that Obama's priorities were domestic. Obama's priorities were his healthcare priorities. He was also dealing with, at that point, 2014, we were still staggering through the end of the Great Recession. So there was still enormous economic issues at play.
Great point. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it just becomes, like anybody, at the end of the day, you can only have so many priorities. And so what you had seen, and this goes back to what we were talking about, how by taking American troops off the ground. So what Obama was assured of when they went back into Iraq was that Americans would not be killed. And there were some killed, but very few relative to, say, the occupation of Iraq. And what that does is it keeps it off the papers. People aren't as concerned. They may be against it, but people are. So by the time the Afghan war becomes most unpopular war in American history, over 80% of Americans saying the war in Afghanistan is not worth it. It's a mistake. And this is about December 2013, if I remember correct.
Yeah.
You're taking very few American casualties at that point in Afghanistan. And the pretext is that we are getting out of Afghanistan. And so what Obama was assured when he goes back into Iraq was, one, this will alleviate political pressure, that you will not be a target. You can concentrate on your domestic priorities, and there will be very little cost, that we are just going to be dropping bombs. And if anyone's killed, it's going to be our Delta or SEALs or CIA guys, and we can kind of keep that on the down low.
Yeah.
So, I think that's a lot of the calculation.
It does. That's just such a great analysis and putting things into context. But it does not alleviate the requirement for leadership, and to not just use the troops as a convenient way to push things off the headlines so that you can get your domestic issues going here, because those are ultimately men and women. And as we now are about to see, those temporary short-term decisions for Obama have led to continued ramifications to this day. Now, let's see how we got after Obama left. Things continued to dwindle because President Trump came into office, and he's like, okay, well, I got these troops here. You know what? Let's give them an actual tactically achievable mission to rid ISIS of their holdings in Raqqa, in Syria, and in Mosul and Iraq. Now, once those missions were finished, by any assessment, especially, even politically talking about domestics, then Trump should have withdrawn them. And in fact, in 2019, once the last of the territorial holdings had been done, Trump actually did say, all right, now we're going to bring the guys home. Now we have a new dynamic to watch in the United States, is that the swamp, or the so-called foreign policy elite, turns against him. And we saw stuff like this.
I'm distressed to be on the floor of the Senate today with my colleague, Senator Graham, to express our deep and profound disappointment in President Trump's decision to withdraw U.S. troops from northeast Syria. We had the opportunity to visit Syria this summer, and we saw what a difference our troops had made there in the fight against ISIS and stabilizing northeast Syria along the Turkish border.
Okay, now there was another issue here, that it wasn't just the Congress, but it was also within his own cabinet. We're going to get to that in just a second, Matt, but I want to zero in on the last part of the senator's comments here, because that's really symptomatic of stuff I saw all throughout both the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria today, is that these belief that, boy, I saw with my own eyes, our troops, they're making a difference. Yeah. And I'm pretty sure that you saw some of these congressional delegations when you were there. I certainly did, where they were coming and they were showing what we called the dog and pony show. They had PowerPoint slides. They were taken to very select places and told what they're seeing and told about all this progress. And so they go back and sincerely say, wow, this is great stuff. But here's the thing. That has nothing to do with American national security. Even what she's saying there, okay, that may be fine for the Syrian Democratic Force. Our army is not designed to defend the Syrian Democratic Forces. It's to defend America. But she conflated those things and made them one.
Right, exactly. And you made me laugh because, yeah, I participated in a number of those dog and pony shows. I mean, you just did it over and over again. You had it for people to understand when VIPs would visit. And so this would include, not just members of Congress, but media, any type of folks coming in from DC, government or non-government. You would take them on these tours and you would go to basically like Potemkin villages, places that you had full control over, where you had a very pliant local population. They were probably all on the take, and they saw their success through you. And you took these VIPs, you took these media folks, these congressional members, on these tours that were completely scripted. And so even the point when members of Congress would come and they would visit, and they'd always want to eat lunch with, Marines or soldiers from their home states or from their districts. Who do you think we sent to talk to them?
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. It was very carefully selected.
And so, certainly what they saw, and the fact that they don't have the sense to understand that, they think they're getting unvarnished truth, is just really.
Matt, I never got invited to go to one of those to be met with the members of Congress. I don't know why that was, but they never selected me for something like that.
I can, I can tell you stories about this where Jack Murtha's legislative aide, and Jack Murtha, people remember he was a member of Congress, and he was one of the first. He was for the Iraq War, and he was one of the first to turn against it. He was very angry, and he was against Obama's escalation in Afghanistan, and he sent one of his guys over. And I remember the guy shows up and he says, and he was wise to the whole dog and pony show circuit, and he said that, and one of the people put him in touch with me when I was there, because they knew I would, run my mouth, and I certainly did. And then not very long later, when I resigned in protest, I was on the front page of the Washington Post. This guy says to Congressman Murtha, "Hey, remember I was telling you about that guy who was mouthing off when I was in Afghanistan?
That's him."
So, but certainly most of the time they do not hear that, and so their perspective is incredibly skewed. It's incredibly skewed. Yeah. But the fact that they can't put together the notion that this is what I heard last year, what I heard the year before, what I heard the year before that, and it's still the same situation or seemingly worse, or there's no end in sight. Why they can? Because they don't want to put it together, and either that's a willful thing.
Yeah. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't stop at Congress, especially in the Trump administration. The so-called swamp or the machine, whatever you want to call it, all the bad terms, was also against him, as we saw when John Bolton jumped up and said, "Yeah, let's don't withdraw."
National Security Advisor John Bolton speaking to Israeli leaders over the weekend, and he appears to really contradict something that the president says. He says that, not to worry, that U.S. troops will not be pulled out of Syria until after ISIS is defeated. And we know what the president said was, he wanted to do it in 30 days because ISIS has already been defeated, right? And I know he sort of massaged that statement a little bit later on, but we've kind of seen this movie before, Major, where the president says something or tweets out something, and then members of his cabinet are sort of dispatched to clarify, if not directly contradict what he said. Who are we to believe here?
It's just fast-moving or actually slow-moving confusion.
Because after all, Mattis left over this decision, which we all sort of thought was firm. Clearly he thought was, I presume, thought was firm too, and now it seems to be
as you pointed out, Major, and as Anne-Marie says, Secretary Mattis resigned over this, but it sounds to me what John Bolton is doing is what other members of the administration, as you point out, have always done. In other words,
seen the Secretary of State do it in North Korea.
Mattis could have probably said, you know what, yes, Mr. President, we're going to do it based on what you've pronounced on Twitter or whatever, but done what Bolton is doing now.
So you saw that so many times. You heard their reference to the Secretary of Defense Mattis actually resigned because I think the second time that Trump said he was going to withdraw the troops from Syria, he ended up saying that 3 times. ended up never doing it. And then at the very end, it wasn't anyone in the administration that was holding him back. It was kind of himself.
Right. And, although at the point where they do start.
I'm sorry, we had a clip there.
Oh,
You showed Trump. Sorry.
And then they say he left troops in Syria. You know what I did? I left troops to take the oil. I took the oil. The only troops I have are taking the oil. They're protecting the oil. I took over.
We're taking the oil. We're not taking
well,
the oil.
Maybe we will. Maybe we won't.
They're protecting the facility.
I don't know. Maybe we should take it. But we have the oil. Right now, the United States has the oil.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. But in the time we have left, Matt, first I want to look at one kind of integral part. And this goes all the way back to the Obama part. It definitely applied during the Trump period and still applies to this day. And that is the legality. We have American troops on the ground in Syria, and the Syrian government didn't exactly invite us. What does that do for our credibility internationally when we always talk about upholding the international rules-based order and all that, as we have troops sitting on the ground in Syria because we want them there who have not been invited? I don't think there's any legality to it that I'm aware of.
No, the American forces in Syria are undertaking an illegal occupation, and the double standard of the U.S., the hypocrisy, all it has done, the millions it has killed, the tens of millions it has displaced, the instability it's caused, right? All these things, is capped off by this hypocrisy, by this double standard, by the recitation of the need for a rules-based order while blatantly violating international law. And, the rest of the world sees through this. And now what we see, I think, not what I think, but what we're seeing is that further anger towards the U.S., the mistrust of the U.S., this disbelief of the U.S. has only been heightened by the U.S. support for Israel and Gaza. And so you're seeing a U.S. that has increasingly become isolated. And as many people talking about, the unipolar world is over. We're moving into a multipolar world. The idea of the United States as the world's hegemon is coming to an end. Well, as the United States does everything it can to control and to keep things from breaking apart, it puts more tension, puts more force, makes these decisions that speeds up this process of the American empire fragmenting.
That's one of the most frustrating things in the world to me, because everybody in the U.S. loves to sound tough and to be strong and, to not let anybody walk all over us and, to not lead from behind. I mean, whatever pejorative you want to be able to use, is that we're doing these things that are actually counterproductive to our own national security, our own economic security, and our own future. And this is one of them, to where we always want to have this finger pointed at all these different countries around the world: Russia, North Korea, Iran. They're violating international rules-based order, ad nauseum, while we're this, kind of right in your face kind of illegal occupation, military possession in another country that definitely has said they don't want us there. And we don't seem to even be concerned at all with those obvious, grotesque double standards that we want to hold people to something. People we don't like, we want to hold them to one standard, and then we hold us to a different standard because, we just want to be there. Whether it's Trump for the oil or Biden, because with no stated reason, he's just leaving us there, which gets us back to the current place we're in right now and to try to figure out where we need to go. Because because of the Israeli-Hamas war and our support for Israel, we have now put targets on the backs of all those troops in Iraq and in Syria and all over the areas where the troops are located there, because the people who were against Israel are seeing that we're for Israel. So they can't target Israel, so they can target us because we're there. If those troops were not there, they wouldn't be targets, and those Iran-backed groups would be powerless to do anything. But instead, they're there, and we've had, I think it's now 105, something like that, attacks since October 17th. Only by the grace of God, one particular attack didn't result in massive casualties because the warhead didn't explode. But how much longer are we going to, just hope luck keeps our troops from being killed?
That's I think what many people see in American strategy is this idea that hope is the strategy. Hope it somehow gets better. Hope somehow it goes away. Hope somehow something, some deus ex machina occurs and something changes. But as we see in Iraq, these attacks going on, the Iraqis just had their provincial council elections on Monday, and the Shia groups did very well. So the groups that would tend to favor or definitely favor Iran did very well in the provincial council elections, and that's without Muqtada al-Sadr's group taking part. So the Shia bloc in Iraq is dominant. That is the complete miscalculation, to be polite, of everything the United States has tried to accomplish in Iraq for more or less the last 30 years. Trying even longer than that, I should say 40 years, because the whole idea has been to get Iraq to be our hedge against Iran, and it has just completely the opposite. Right? I mean, just a miscalculation is a very polite way of saying what happened. Yeah.
Right. Hey, Matt, let me ask you this question, though, because in all honesty, so you did a great job of painting the picture around Obama with the domestic and the internal politics and all that in 2014 that led him in there. Use that same kind of lens here now and tell me, what is putting the pressure on Biden right now? Because by any just rational, especially military calculation, you would say, hey, redeploy those troops out of there. There's a bunch of other places in the Middle East we could move them that would redeploy them, take them out of risk, take us out of risk of getting sucked into a war, and still maintain all of our capacities with no diminution whatsoever. But he's not. He's afraid to move because one of the charges is that, if you leave now, man, you'll show how weak you are, because you'll show that the Iran-backed groups come in there. That was their objective, is to get America out, and you just were a tool of Iran, and you did that. So for sure he would face that kind of attack again. But what could the president do, given those realities, but to take care of our troops? How can he do that in this environment?
Yeah, so his fear is that every Sunday, Lindsey Graham or Tom Cotton or Mitch McConnell are going to be on Meet the Press saying exactly what you said, and that's the political fear. But you also have decades of American policy that have created an inertia that anything other than moving forward, at the least maintaining a presence, is defeat. So this idea that they in DC, they look at the map of the world, and all those places that are shaded blue for the United States must remain that way. And if you want to be really good at running the empire, you expand it. I mean, so there's this institutional pressure, historical pressure to be there, because the idea of doing anything else it's just not possible. You can't do that. So you've had decades of people who've been in power who have viewed the world that way, who then have handed over that power to people who similarly view it, but that's being compounded by the experience. I mean, I had this experience one of the few times, I think the only time I ever talked to Donald Rumsfeld, of standing in the hallway, one of the corridors of the Pentagon, and I was a Marine Corps captain, and Secretary of Defense comes over, and he's very nice and he's very charming, and he says, and I'm standing in front of a big portrait of Eisenhower, and he says, "You know how old I am? I worked with that guy. That's how old I am." I used to work, not new, right? I mean, so but the idea, though, is that history is never really that far back. In Eisenhower, he was a young officer graduating from West Point. He would have known officers who had fought in the Civil War. I mean, so history is never that far removed. But the lessons of that and those mindsets then are promulgated, are compounded upon. I mean, so you get to this point where I don't think our conversation here, in the parlance of Washington, establishment Washington, D.C., which both you and I have very publicly rejected, is that we are not serious. Because anything that is not a militarized solution, and more importantly, anything that would possibly give up a terrain, if you will, so parts of the empire, but then affect our credibility, is simply not serious. It can't even be broached. So the idea of pulling the troops out is something that, you couldn't get within 3 miles of the White House to suggest it. I mean, it's unfortunately that's the reality of it. But the thing is, though, is then of course, then it's what happens next. Then what is going to be that I just used inertia. What is going to be that you talk about inertia, the black hole effect, if American troops are killed in Iraq or Syria? It won't just be Lindsey Graham and on Meet the Press saying that Biden is weak and he's hurting our credibility. But it will be calls by not just Republicans, but Democrats for massive American response.
Yeah, you cannot allow our troops to just sit there and be attacked and do nothing. You've got to go, and I'm tired of these pinpricks. Go straight after the IRGC in Iran. Go after the Iranian leaders. Trump, Lindsey Graham's already saying that he'll be joined in a chorus, I think, by others. And so the perverse thing to me, which is one of the biggest drivers of why I'm so adamant to get troops out, is because the death of an American troop will not only not end that problem, it will be used as justification to get more people killed and to draw us deeper, which will then, of course, have the high probability that even more troops die as a result of that. That is what is so anguishing to me, because we can see the likelihood of that is very high, as opposed to pulling out now where we can, well, I don't even need to finish that sentence. It's just so disgraceful.
I mean, we have all kinds of examples of like this, and it just puts the American, puts the United States in a worse position. It weakens us. And then, of course, the consequences physically, morally, economically for all this. But look at the decision making with regards to Ukraine. You know, the diplomatic options that were available were dismissed, and Russia was provoked. And I mean, all these things. And now here we are, almost 2 years into Russia's invasion, and Russia clearly is in control of what's going to happen.
That's right. We actually had a show on that yesterday where we detailed all the things you mentioned were graphically detailed and leaving us in this bad position. Now, I just don't want to get into another bad one there, but maybe.
Right. And then the other example that too is you see all the outrage about what's happening with the Red Sea, with the Houthis affecting global shipping like that. The outrage over that in Washington, D.C., but the idea that this would simply go away, the Red Sea problem would go away, is if we stop the Israelis from continuing their killing in Gaza. That is something that you can't, another thing that you couldn't broach. You would be treated as not serious when that is the only answer. And that's the actual answer. And that's why the Houthis are doing this. But understanding that and accepting these uncomfortable, inconvenient truths is it's forbidden in Washington.
And it's just unfortunate because, I mean, really, you can go all the way back to Bush, Obama, Trump, now Biden. We don't have the requisite leadership that's willing to buck the political system to do the right thing. The thing that there's a lot of evidence is the right one. But, man, we could keep going on for hours here. And I'd love to. And we'll definitely continue this conversation when we have you back next time. We also want to take a look at some of these same concepts in the China-Taiwan issue, because there's a lot of even more minefields that we have to be careful to navigate there with some of these same dynamics. And I want to talk about that in a future show with you. But that's all we have for you today. Matt, thanks so much for being with us. As always, we're very grateful to have you on.
Yeah, thank you, Danny. And Merry Christmas to you and your family.
And the same to you.
Yeah, and I hope in a new year we can see each other in person. But then in Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays to everyone who's watching and listening as well.
And I say the same as well to you and to all you out there. But you actually get a chance to see we got another really good show for you this afternoon at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. We have Professor Bartov, who's a former IDF soldier, is going to talk to us about who is Hamas. So if you want to tune back in for that, really enlightening things that you probably don't know from watching regular television, that will really open your eyes. So tune back in then. But in the meantime, we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you the truth that you need to make sense of your world. We will see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.